Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material.
Right.
So imagine, just for a second, being forced to live in a graveyard. Like if anyone comes within 50 feet of you, the actual law requires you to ring a bell, to tear your clothes and scream, unclean, unclean, to warn them away from your very existence.
It's a terrifying thought.
Completely. I mean, you haven't felt the warmth of a handshake, let alone a hug, in maybe a decade. You are medically decaying and socially just dead.
Yeah, socially erased, really.
Exactly. And today, we're looking at an ancient text where a man does the unthinkable. He reaches out and physically grasps someone in that exact situation.
Which was completely scandalous.
It shatters the social order of the day. So, welcome to this deep dive. We have this incredibly rich journey ahead of us today, focusing on chapters 8 through 13 of the biblical book of Matthew.
And it's a staggering collection of literature because the author shifts gears so dramatically in this section.
Yeah, because before this, it's mostly teaching, right?
Right. Prior to this, we have these long, unbroken philosophical and ethical discourses. But here, the narrative just accelerates into this rapid-fire sequence of encounters.
Like rapid-fire miracles.
Yes, physical healings, natural disasters, and then these deeply cryptic agricultural parables. And we are pulling from the original text today, but layered with extensive historical and cultural analysis from commentators like Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Which is super helpful because, these are scholars who spent their entire lives deconstructing the ancient Greek, right?
Exactly, and uncovering the cultural assumptions of that first century Mediterranean world, which carries so much psychological weight.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the goal today isn't to just walk away with, a degree in first century antiquities.
Right, definitely not.
We want to act as guides through this material to figure out how these ancient words act as a mirror for you, for our listeners, in our own lives today.
Because we are looking at a text that fundamentally rewired human history. It challenged how humanity thinks about power, about suffering, authority, and growth.
And to get there, we really need to dive straight into the deep end of the social pool of the ancient Near East.
Yeah, so to fully grasp why the opening of chapter 8 was so shocking to its original audience, you really have to picture the rigid stratification of that society.
It was very layered.
Heavily. It was a world entirely obsessed with purity laws. And at the absolute bottom of that social hierarchy was the leper.
Because it wasn't just a medical issue.
No, leprosy wasn't just a terrible skin disease. In the Levitical framework of the time, it was viewed as a literal physical manifestation of divine displeasure.
Wow.
It was ritual impurity walking on two legs. The commentary points out that it wasn't even treated by doctors, it was diagnosed by priests.
So it's a spiritual diagnosis, essentially.
Right. And when you were declared a leper, you were essentially excommunicated from the human race. You lost your family, your livelihood, your religious community, your dignity.
You were entirely isolated. They were the ultimate untouchables.
Exactly.
And the visceral reality of that is just terrifying. And yet this narrative opens with a leper approaching the central figure of this text, Jesus.
Right. The leper comes right up to him.
And the leper says, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." He recognizes the power, but throws himself entirely on the mercy of the healer's will.
Which is a huge risk for him to even approach.
Completely. And the text doesn't say Jesus just spoke a blessing over him from afar. It says he put forth his hand and he touched him.
And the Greek word used there, it implies more than just a light tap. It implies taking hold of, like grasping.
Really? So a firm physical connection?
Yes. It is a profound, deliberate physical connection. Mm-hmm. By touching the leper, Jesus willingly crosses the strictest, most terrifying purity boundary of his culture.
Because under the law, touching a leper makes you unclean.
Exactly. You caught their impurity. But the narrative flips that entire mechanism of contagion on its head. He proves that he is not infected by the brokenness of the world. Instead, his wholeness infects the brokenness.
Right. He risks social and religious defilement to demonstrate that true authority is inextricably linked to profound empathy.
Well, wait, hold on. Think about the sheer efficiency of this, because we see later in the text that he is perfectly capable of healing people from miles away with just a word.
Oh, absolutely.
So why bother with the touch? If the goal is just to cure the disease, speaking a word from 10 feet away achieves the exact same medical outcome, right?
True.
And you do it without breaking any social taboos or risking your own reputation. It feels almost unnecessarily provocative.
Well, it is entirely provocative, and that is kind of the whole point. The touch wasn't necessary for the medical cure, but it was absolutely essential for the human restoration.
The disease took away the man's physical health, but the forced isolation took away his humanity. Writing a check, or in this case, speaking a word from a distance, is efficient. It solves the biological problem.
It doesn't solve the social one.
Right. The physical touch says, I see you. You are not repulsive to me. It restores dignity before it even restores health.
That's powerful.
It bridges the gap between the clean and the unclean in a way that a distant, sterilized transaction never could. It tells the reader that true wisdom requires uncomfortable proximity to another person's pain.
It really forces you to look in the mirror. Because if we translate this, who are the modern untouchables?
Yeah, that's the real question.
We might not have the same Levitical purity laws, but we absolutely have social lepers today.
Oh, without a doubt.
We have people with deep, visible addictions. We have chronically homeless. We have people who have been publicly shamed, canceled, or ostracized by our political or social tribes.
The people we literally cross the street to avoid.
Exactly. And it's so much easier to advocate for them through a screen.
Yeah.
Right? Or donate to a charity rather than to actually sit across a table from them.
To physically or emotionally touch them.
Right. To acknowledge their shared humanity. It's tough.
It is. And the text doesn't let up, because it immediately pivots from the ultimate religious outcast to the ultimate political enemy.
The centurion.
Yes, a Roman centurion enters the scene asking for healing for his paralyzed servant. If the leper was an outcast because of impurity, the centurion was the oppressor.
He's the occupying force.
Exactly. He represented the military machine that was currently taxing and brutalizing the local population. He was a Gentile, a pagan. To the local audience, this man was the face of the enemy empire.
Yet, this hardened military commander comes with this astonishing level of self-awareness. He essentially tells Jesus, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof.
Which is wild coming from a Roman officer.
Totally. He says, I understand how authority works. I tell my soldiers to go, and they go.
Yeah.
You don't need to come to my house. Just speak the word, and my servant will be healed.
And Jesus is stunned by this.
Yeah, he turns to the crowd and says he hasn't found faith this great anywhere in Israel.
And the commentaries note how deeply offensive that would have been to the religious elite of the day.
I can imagine.
The centurion recognizes that Jesus carries an authority that supersedes the physical world, operating much like the chain of command in the Roman military, but, on a cosmic scale.
Right.
And Jesus takes this moment to make a devastating cultural critique. He warns that many will come from the East and the West, meaning the outsiders, the Gentiles, the enemies.
And sit down at the table?
Yes, sit down at the table in the kingdom of heaven. Meanwhile, the children of the kingdom, the religious insiders who assumed their heritage and correct theology guaranteed their status, will be cast out into outer darkness.
It completely dismantles the arrogance of the in-group.
Utterly dismantles it.
It suggests that profound understanding and virtue are often found on the absolute margins, among the people our society conditions us to hate or dismiss.
Right, the exact people we've written off.
And that is a brutal reality check. Because we all have an outgroup. You listening to this, you have an outgroup.
We all do.
That political demographic, that socioeconomic class or cultural faction that we have entirely written off as ignorant or irredeemable.
Yeah, the people we think have nothing to teach us.
Exactly. To look at the enemy and recognize that they might possess a clearer understanding of truth and humility than our own inner circle, that requires a complete shattering of the ego.
It really does. But it's one thing to bridge those social divides and examine our prejudices when our feet are on solid ground, right?
Sure.
It is an entirely different challenge when our environment is completely out of control. And the narrative anticipates this. It moves us from the healing of bodies and breaking of social boundaries to the sheer chaos of the natural world.
The storm on the sea.
Yes, the scene shifts to the Sea of Galilee.
And the Sea of Galilee is notorious for this. It's essentially a large freshwater lake situated in a deep basin surrounded by hills.
Right, which creates a specific climate.
Exactly. It creates this wind tunnel effect where violent squalls can drop down onto the water with almost zero warning. And the text says Jesus and his disciples get into a boat, and a tempest arises that is so severe the boat is covered with waves.
And remember, these disciples were not tourists.
No, many of them were seasoned, lifelong fishermen. They made their living on this exact body of water. So if they thought they were going to die, they were genuinely in a catastrophic situation.
Exactly. And the contrast in the boat is just striking. The disciples are in a state of absolute terror, scrambling, bailing water, totally certain of their imminent drowning.
And Jesus is asleep.
He is asleep. They finally shake him awake, screaming, "Lord, save us, we perish."
Which is fair.
Right, but before he addresses the life-threatening storm outside the boat, he turns and addresses the psychological storm inside the disciples. He asks them, "Why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith?" He rebukes their internal panic before he ever turns around to rebuke the wind and the waves.
See, I struggle with this passage immensely. I really do.
Why is that?
Because they are in a tiny wooden boat. It is actively taking on water. The physics of the situation dictate that they are sinking. Panic is not a moral failing here. It's a biological imperative.
That's a very modern, rational way to look at it, yeah.
It's the amygdala firing up to keep them alive.
Yeah.
How is sleeping through a literal disaster supposed to be the model of wisdom? If my business is collapsing or I'm waiting on biopsy results for someone I love and someone tells me, "Why are you fearful?" That feels dismissive.
It feels like toxic positivity almost.
Exactly. It borders on a kind of spiritualized toxic positivity.
And that reaction is exactly why this text demands careful unpacking. The superficial reading is, if you have enough faith, you'll never feel negative emotions. But that's not what is actually happening.
Okay, so what is happening?
The commentators suggest we contrast this with, say, Stoic philosophy. A Stoic master might sit in the sinking boat and say, "I cannot control the weather. I can only control my reaction."
Right. Death is a natural process, so I will detach my emotions and drown with dignity.
Yes, but the text is not advocating for emotional detachment or apathy here.
Right. He isn't saying, who cares if we drown, it's out of our hands.
Exactly the opposite. He is offering a trusted anchor. The sleep isn't negligence or a denial of reality. It is a demonstration of ultimate anchored trust in a divine order that supersedes the chaos of the elements.
So he's essentially grounded in something deeper.
Yes. The disciples are chided not for waking him up, and certainly not for wanting to survive, but because their fear completely blinded them to who is in the boat with them.
They lost perspective.
Exactly. The external crisis hijacked their internal reality to the point where they forgot their proximity to the source of life itself.
That makes a lot of sense.
When we face our own modern storms, economic collapse, health crises, relational betrayal, the immediate danger isn't always the external circumstance. The more insidious danger is the internal panic that disconnects us from our foundations.
It makes us turn on each other and convinces us that chaos has the final word.
Precisely.
So the panic is a symptom of forgetting the anchor. And once he addresses their perspective, he stands up and calms the wind and the sea with a word.
Best like that.
And they land on the opposite shore. But the moment they step off the boat, they trade a meteorological storm for a storm of human madness.
Yes, the region of the Gird scenes.
Right. They are confronted by two men possessed by demons living in the tombs, described as exceedingly fierce.
And we encounter a significant translation barrier for the modern reader here.
Because of the language of demons.
Right. The ancient worldview attributed severe psychological, mental, and physical illnesses to demonic possession. Today, we utilize the language of psychiatry, neurobiology, and trauma to describe many of these afflictions.
Right. We have clinical terms now.
Exactly. But we do a massive disservice to the text if we get bogged down in a debate over first-century supernatural cosmology versus modern clinical diagnostics.
Because the manifestation of the suffering is identical, regardless of the vocabulary you use.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is that the underlying human devastation is the same.
Right. Whether you label it a demonic entity, profound schizophrenia, severe trauma, or violent addiction, the result is the same. These forces isolate us. They strip away dignity.
And these men were living in graveyards, naked and violent, so volatile that the entire community had essentially quarantined the area. They were entirely alienated from the world of the living.
And the narrative presents Jesus confronting this chaotic, isolating force and bringing total restoration. The destructive spirits leave the men. But here is where the story takes a deeply uncomfortable turn.
Yes, it reveals the dark underbelly of human sociology.
The spirits are allowed to enter a nearby herd of swine, which subsequently stampede off a cliff and drown in the sea.
Which is, as you can imagine, a massive economic catastrophe for the region.
Oh, completely. A herd of pigs of that size was a significant agricultural asset.
Precisely. And watch the reaction of the townspeople. They come out, they see the two men who had been a terror to the region sitting there, fully restored, clothed, And in their right minds,
You would expect a massive celebration?
you would expect tears of joy from their families. But instead, they calculate the economic loss of the swine, look at the disruptive power of this healer, and they literally beg him to leave their borders.
They care more about the pigs than the people.
Yes. The restoration of human life was just too expensive for them. They preferred the predictable misery of the status quo.
The men suffering in the tombs was a known quantity.
Exactly. It was a localized problem they had learned to manage. But a power that disrupts their entire economy to save two broken individuals, that was terrifying to them. They chose the safety of their profit margins over the messy, costly work of human redemption.
It's a devastating critique of how we structure our societies today. I mean, it is so easy to point fingers at those ancient villagers, but NEVism not in my backyard is alive and well.
Oh, absolutely is.
We make these exact calculations continually. We look at the systemic issues in our cities, homelessness, the opioid epidemic, the foster care crisis. We know there are people living in modern tombs.
Yes.
But when a solution is proposed that might increase our taxes, lower our property values, or disrupt our comfortable routines, our collective response is often to beg the solution to leave our borders.
We tolerate the suffering as long as it stays safely contained in the margins.
Exactly, where it doesn't threaten our economic stability.
And that profound resistance to disruption leads naturally into the conversations recorded in chapters 8 and 10 regarding the sheer cost of pursuing this kind of wisdom.
Because it's not cheap.
No, it's not. The miracles, the healings, calming storms, restoring the broken, they are incredibly attractive. They draw massive crowds. People see the power and they want to join the movement.
Naturally.
But the author pivots sharply to strip away any illusions. This is not a comfortable self-help program designed to, optimize your morning routine.
Right, we see this play out in two brief, really illuminating interactions. First, a scribe, a highly educated religious scholar, approaches Jesus with what sounds like the ultimate commitment.
He's very eager.
Very. He says, "Master, I will follow thee whithersoever thou goest." He's energized. He's ready to pack his bags. And Jesus immediately throws a bucket of ice water on his enthusiasm.
Yes, he says, "The foxes have holes, and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head."
So what's the underlying message there?
The commentators, particularly Matthew Henry, suggests this scribe was caught up in the spectacle. He likely assumed that aligning himself with a figure of such miraculous power would inevitably lead to a position of influence or wealth or at least comfort.
Like getting in on the ground floor of a successful startup.
Exactly. And Jesus is dismantling that expectation instantly. He is telling the man, if you sign up for this, you are signing up for absolute vulnerability. You are choosing a path of homelessness, rejection, and physical hardship.
Wow.
You are asking for the crown, but have you considered the cross?
It's the ultimate reality check for the dopamine-chasing enthusiast. We see this psychological pattern everywhere today.
Oh, constantly.
It's the person who watches an incredible documentary about a grueling ultramarathon, feels a massive surge of inspiration, spends $2,000 on elite running gear, and then quits 3 days later.
Because waking up at 4 a.m. in the freezing rain is miserable.
Right. They fell in love with the romanticized idea of the destination, but they had absolutely no root system to sustain the agonizing reality of the journey. They wanted the glory without the grit.
And immediately following the hasty scribe, the text presents the inverse problem, the perpetually delayed disciple.
Right, the guy who wants to wait.
Another man says, "Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father." And the response he receives sounds shockingly callous to modern and ancient ears. Jesus tells him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their dead."
Honestly, that sounds like a cult leader telling someone to cut off their family. Burying a parent is one of the most sacred, fundamental human duties across every culture on earth. How can a teacher of compassion demand that someone abandon their grieving family?
I know, it's jarring. But this is a classic example of where ancient idiom meets modern misunderstanding. We have to unpack the cultural hyperbole.
So it's not literal.
Right. Biblical scholars point out that this likely does not mean the man's father was currently a corpse lying in the living room awaiting a funeral. In the cultural parlance of the time, "let me bury my father" was often a recognized idiom meaning, let me stay home, fulfill my filial duties, take care of my father into his old age until he eventually passes away, inherit the estate, and then I will be free to follow you.
Okay. So it wasn't a request for a 3-day bereavement leave. It was a request for an indefinite, multi-year postponement.
Exactly. As the commentary notes, the want of leisure is often just the want of inclination. The man is using a highly respected cultural duty as an impenetrable shield against the radical, immediate call to spiritual awakening.
So it's an excuse dressed up as morality.
Yes. Jesus' hyperbolic response, "Let the dead bury their dead," is a jarring philosophical statement about ultimate priorities. He is saying, let those who are spiritually dead concern themselves entirely with the maintenance of the physical world.
But you have encountered the truth, and the truth demands your immediate allegiance.
Precisely. When the call to profound transformation arrives, it cannot be perpetually deferred until the circumstances of your life are perfectly convenient, because they will never be perfectly convenient.
That is so true. And the text turns the dial on that tension even higher in chapter 10. Jesus is sending his disciples out to teach and heal, and the briefing he gives them is terrifying.
He pulls no punches.
He shatters the illusion that this path of compassion will make them universally beloved. He says, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother."
And a man's foes shall be they of his own household.
Right, which is heavy.
If we translate the underlying mechanics of that statement, it is a profound observation about the sociology of truth. We tend to romanticize peace as the mere absence of conflict, but truth is inherently polarizing.
How so?
When you commit to a life of radical mercy, uncompromising justice, and deep spiritual authenticity, the kind of life that touches untouchable lepers and exposes the hypocrisy of the powerful, it will inevitably generate intense friction.
Because you stop playing by the unspoken rules of the systems around you.
Precisely. The sword he speaks of is not a literal weapon of violence. It is a metaphor for surgical division.
Like a scalpel?
Yes. If you are part of a family system that relies on toxic secrets, unspoken resentments, or performative status, and you suddenly decide to live in absolute transparent truth, your family will not applaud you.
They will probably attack you.
Right, they will attack you. You become a threat to the homeostasis of the dysfunction. The pursuit of this wisdom will put you at variance with your own household, your corporate culture, and your social circles if those entities are heavily invested in the superficial or the unjust.
It really demands an inventory of our own lives. Like, are we only pursuing personal growth and a spiritual depth when it aligns perfectly with our social climbing?
That's a great question to ask ourselves.
Do we retreat the moment our convictions make us unpopular at the dinner table? It's a sobering realization that genuine transformation might cost you the approval of the people closest to you.
It absolutely might.
So if the cost is that astronomical homelessness, vulnerability, family division, social ostracization, why on earth would anyone pursue it? What is the counterbalance here?
The narrative answers this in chapters 9, 11, and 12 by showing us the alternative. Because the alternative to this path isn't freedom. The alternative is the suffocating, crushing weight of legalism and performative living.
To understand the profound relief this wisdom offers, we have to examine the recurring, intense conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, the religious elite of the day.
And the primary battlefield for this conflict was the Sabbath.
Which is fascinating because the Sabbath was originally instituted as a profound act of grace, right? It was a divine mandate for a day of rest, specifically designed to remind human beings that their worth was not tied to their economic output. You are not a machine. You are allowed to stop working.
But over the centuries, the religious institutions had fundamentally corrupted that gift. Through extensive traditions, eventually codified in texts like the Mishnah, they had built a labyrinthine structure of micro-legislation around the Sabbath to ensure it was never accidentally violated.
Like a fence around the law.
Exactly. They defined 39 major categories of forbidden work, which were then subdivided into hundreds of specific prohibitions. They debated exactly how many steps you could take, what items you could carry, and what constituted medical treatment versus forbidden labor.
Sounds exhausting.
They took the profound gift of rest and weaponized it into an exhausting, anxiety-inducing burden of religious compliance.
And Jesus intentionally provokes them on this exact issue. In chapter 12, he and his disciples are walking through a grain field on the Sabbath. The disciples are hungry, so they start plucking heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands, and eating them.
And the Pharisees, who are apparently policing the fields, pounce on this instantly.
Right, they accuse the disciples of harvesting and threshing on the Sabbath. And later, Jesus enters the synagogue, and there is a man with a withered hand. The Pharisees watch Jesus like hawks, hoping to catch him healing the man, because in their legal framework, healing a non-life-threatening condition on the Sabbath was a violation of the law.
And Jesus confronts their entire theological framework head-on. He heals the man's hand in front of everyone. But his justification is what is truly revolutionary.
So what does this all mean? How does he justify it?
He quotes the ancient prophet Hosea to them. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. He publicly declares that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He is telling the preeminent religious scholars of his nation that they have entirely missed the heartbeat of their own religion.
He is establishing the hierarchy of morality, the scaffolding versus the building.
Yes. The core wisdom here is that religious rituals, institutional rules, and moral codes exist solely to serve human flourishing. They are the scaffolding designed to build a healthy society.
But the Pharisees had fallen so deeply in love with the scaffolding that they were willing to let the human being collapse to protect it.
Exactly. When a rule or tradition becomes more important than the relief of human suffering, that rule has ceased to be holy. It has become an idol. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus demonstrates that restoring a broken human being is the highest, most profound way to honor the day of rest.
But let me play devil's advocate for a moment.
Sure.
We need laws, don't we? We need institutional boundaries.
Yeah.
If we operate on the premise that everyone can just disregard the rules whenever they personally feel merciful or compassionate in the moment, society disintegrates into total subjective chaos. How does this philosophy not just lead to religious and social anarchy?
It's a vital question. And the text is not advocating for anarchy or the abolition of moral law. It is advocating for a lens of interpretation.
Okay, unpack that.
The law is a blunt instrument. Compassion is the lens through which the law must be read. If your strict application of a rule results in the compounding of human misery, you are misapplying the rule.
That makes sense.
Jesus isn't destroying the concept of the Sabbath. He is fulfilling its original intent, restoring a man's capacity to live fully. He is demanding that the spirit of the law must always govern the letter of the law.
And this conflict over the crushing weight of religious rules provides the backdrop for arguably the most famous, psychologically profound invitation in the entire text, found at the end of chapter 11.
Yes.
Jesus looks at the crowds who are exhausted by the impossible demands of the religious leaders, and he says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light."
The translation of this into our modern psychological landscape is just breathtaking.
Yeah.
We may not be laboring under the 39 categories of Sabbath law, but we live in a culture entirely defined by performative exhaustion.
We are chronically burdened.
Yes. We are on a relentless treadmill trying to justify our existence and secure our worth. We do it through our career achievements, the meticulous curation of our digital lives, our relentless pursuit of physical perfection.
And even our performative morality, where we constantly signal our political purity to avoid being excommunicated by our peer groups. We are carrying a massive, invisible yoke of conditional acceptance.
And his solution isn't a vacation. That's the fascinating part. He doesn't say, come to me, lie down in a hammock, and you'll never have to do anything again.
Right.
He says, take my yoke upon you. And an agricultural yoke is a heavy wooden beam fastened over the necks of two animals, usually oxen, to allow them to pull a plow. It is an instrument of grueling labor.
So why does he call it easy?
The mechanics of the yoke are the key. In ancient farming, a young, inexperienced, chaotic ox was yoked to an older, massive, seasoned ox. The older ox bore the vast majority of the weight and set the pace and the direction.
Oh, I see.
The younger ox simply had to walk alongside and learn the rhythm. Jesus is saying, you are pulling a plow of self-justification that is destroying you. Put down that heavy, isolating yoke. Step into this yoke with me.
So it is still a life of forward motion.
Yes, the demands of discipleship, the cost we discussed earlier, remain. But the source of the energy shifts fundamentally. You are no longer pulling in order to earn your worth, your rest, or your acceptance. You are pulling from a place of already being fully accepted and deeply rested.
The burden becomes light because you are no longer bearing the psychological weight of your own salvation.
Exactly.
The profound relief of that is hard to overstate. But practically, how do you make that shift? How do you transition from a lifetime of anxious, performative hustling to this rhythm of grace?
The text actually offers a brilliant metaphor for the mechanics of this transformation in chapter 9, the wineskins. Jesus notes that you do not put new wine into old wineskins.
Right. We have to look at the chemistry and materials of the ancient world. Wine wasn't stored in glass bottles. It was stored in the treated skins of animals, like goats.
And when fresh, unfermented wine is placed in a new, supple skin, the fermentation process releases gases that cause the liquid to expand. Because the new skin is elastic, it stretches to accommodate the expansion.
But if you pour that actively fermenting new wine into an old, dried-out, brittle skin, the expansion will immediately shatter the rigid leather, ruining both the skin and the wine.
It is the perfect metaphor for neuroplasticity and behavioral change.
Oh, that's a great connection.
If you have a profound internal awakening, if you realize you are suffocating under a heavy yoke and you desperately want to transition to a life of grace and deep presence, you cannot simply pour that expansive new reality into the rigid, exhausted habits of your current life.
You can't experience a spiritual awakening and then try to cram it into a schedule that involves working 80 hours a week, doom scrolling for 3 hours a night, and operating on 4 hours of sleep.
Exactly. The new mindset requires new structures. It requires new flexible wineskins, new daily rhythms, new boundaries with your technology, new ways of interacting with your family.
If you don't build the new structures to hold the new life, the old habits will inevitably fracture under the pressure, and the inspiration will be lost.
Furthermore, the commentary notes a profound gentleness here. You cannot force the advanced disciplines of this new life onto beginners all at once. Growth requires patience and the proper environment.
Which brings us perfectly to the final major theme of our deep dive. We've examined the redefinition of compassion, the navigation of internal storms, the radical cost of truth, and the liberating exchange of yokes. But the inevitable question remains: how does this wisdom actually take root in a human life over the long haul?
And to answer this, in chapter 13, the author dramatically shifts the pedagogical method. Jesus begins speaking almost exclusively in parables, utilizing the imagery of first-century agriculture to map out the slow, invisible, and highly variable process of human development.
The shift to parables is a masterstroke of communication. Direct didactic teaching often triggers our intellectual defense mechanisms. We hear a rule, and we immediately look for the loophole.
We all do it. But a parable bypasses the intellect and plants a complex narrative image in the imagination. It forces the listener to chew on the meaning.
The foundational parable here is the sower and the soils. A farmer scatters identical seed across 4 vastly different terrains, representing 4 distinct psychological responses to truth. Let's analyze the pathology of these soils because they are incredibly accurate psychological profiles.
Yeah.
First, some seed falls on the wayside, the hard beaten path running through the field.
And it cannot penetrate the compacted dirt, and the birds immediately swoop down and devour it. This is the entirely closed mind.
Right.
It represents the person whose internal world is so compacted by cynicism, pride, or rigid confirmation bias that new information cannot even make a dent. The truth bounces off the surface of their ego.
They hear the wisdom, but it doesn't register long enough to even be considered before it is snatched away by the next distraction. Then we have the stony places, the seed falls where there is a very thin layer of soil sitting on top of a solid bedrock of limestone.
Right, so because the soil is shallow, the seed germinates rapidly, it shoots up overnight.
But the moment the sun rises and the heat intensifies, the plant withers and dies because its roots cannot penetrate the rock to find moisture.
This is the emotional adrenaline junkie. This is the hasty scribe we discussed earlier. They attend a motivational seminar, read a groundbreaking book, or have an emotional religious experience, and they are instantly euphoric. This changes my entire paradigm, they declare.
They look incredibly promising on the surface.
But they've done absolutely no deep foundational work. There is an impenetrable layer of unbroken ego or unhealed trauma just beneath the surface. The moment they face the heat of adversity, the moment the new habit gets difficult or their friends mock their new worldview, they completely collapse. They possess enthusiasm, but zero resilience.
But the third soil is the one that I think haunts modern readers the most. The seed falls among thorns. It actually takes deep root. It begins to grow into a robust plant. But the root system of the thorns is already established in the soil.
And the weeds grow up alongside the good plant, aggressively compete for the nutrients, water, and sunlight, and eventually choke the plant into barrenness. It survives, but it produces absolutely no fruit.
And the text provides an explicit, devastating diagnosis of what these thorns represent in the human psyche. Jesus identifies the thorns as the care of this world and the deceitfulness of riches.
It is arguably the most accurate diagnosis of the 21st century condition ever written. Notice the mechanism of destruction here. The plant in the thorny ground is not destroyed by a catastrophic storm. It is not burned up by the fierce heat of persecution. It is quietly, slowly, almost imperceptibly suffocated.
The cares of this world. The endless gnawing anxieties of modern existence, the crushing weight of the mortgage, the relentless pinging of the inbox, the geopolitical dread, the pressure to optimize our children's extracurricular activities.
Yes. We allow our cognitive bandwidth to be entirely consumed by a million microstresses. And paired with that is the deceitfulness of riches. The insidious illusion that if we can just acquire a little bit more capital, secure the next promotion, or upgrade our lifestyle, we will finally achieve peace and security.
These forces don't violently attack our pursuit of wisdom. They simply crowd it out.
They do.
We are rarely destroyed by sudden tragedy. Our depth is slowly choked to death by trivia. We allow the urgent demands of the superficial to strangle the quiet growth of the profound. We just become too relentlessly busy, too distracted, and too obsessed with maintaining our standard of living to cultivate any actual wisdom.
It's a chilling reflection.
And finally, we have the good ground, the soil that has been broken up, cleared of rocks, and weeded. The seed falls, takes deep root, and yields a massive harvest, some 30, 60, or 100-fold.
And the distinguishing characteristic of the good ground, according to the text, is not perfection. It is the hearer who actually understands the word, internalizes it, and protects the environment of their heart so that the slow process of growth can yield observable change in their character.
But the agricultural metaphor doesn't end there. He tells another parable about a field that delves deep into the sociology of human communities and the problem of evil. It is the parable of the wheat and the tares, and the psychology behind it is absolutely fascinating.
Yes, in this narrative, a landowner sows premium wheat in his field, but under the cover of darkness, an enemy infiltrates the field and deliberately sows tares among the wheat.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We have to understand the specific botany involved.
Right. The weed referenced in the original Greek is zizania, commonly known as darnel. Darnel is an evolutionary mimic. During its early and middle stages of growth, its stalk and leaves look virtually identical to genuine wheat. Only an expert could tell them apart.
Oh, wow. So you literally couldn't tell them apart until it's too late.
Exactly. But as they mature and head out, the difference becomes stark. Furthermore, darnel is not just a nuisance, it is highly toxic.
Wait, really? Toxic?
Yes. The commentary points out that a fungus often grows on darnel seeds that acts as a soporific poison. If it is harvested and ground into flour with the wheat, it causes severe dizziness, nausea, and even death. It was a known, devastating tactic of agricultural sabotage in the ancient world.
That is wild. So months go by, and as the plants finally begin to mature, the servants suddenly realize the field is heavily infested with this toxic weed. They are horrified and furious.
They run to the landowner and say, "Didn't you plant good seed? An enemy has done this. Give us the word, and we will go out into the field right now and rip every single weed out by the roots."
And the landowner gives a response that violates every human instinct for justice and purity. He says, "No. Lest while you gather but the tares, you uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest."
Because the landowner understands the subterranean reality of the field, the darnel and the wheat have been growing side by side for months, so their root systems are completely, inextricably entangled beneath the soil.
So if you pull one.
If you send in zealous servants to violently rip out the toxic weeds, they will inevitably destroy the root system of the healthy wheat in the process. You cannot extract the bad without slaughtering the good. You have to endure the tension. You have to wait until the very end when the plants are fully mature and the harvest naturally separates them.
If you lay this template over human history, and particularly our current cultural moment, it is a devastating indictment of our obsession with purity spirals and ideological purges.
Absolutely. Think about the psychology of the servants. They spot the contamination, and their immediate visceral reaction is a crusade. Let's rip them out. Let's cleanse the field.
We do this constantly. We see it in corporate witch hunts, where an entire department is decimated to root out one bad actor. We see it violently in political history. Every revolution that attempts to violently purge the imprecise or the disloyal ends up sending the innocent to the guillotine.
And we see it microculturally in cancel culture.
Right. We identify someone in our social circle or our online community who holds a problematic view or makes a mistake, and our immediate instinct is to excommunicate them, to rip them out of the field, to protect the purity of our group.
We suffer from the profound arrogance of the servants. We genuinely believe that our vision is sharp enough to perfectly distinguish the wheat from the darnel in the middle of the growing season. We believe we possess the surgical precision necessary to extract the flawed individuals without damaging the complex web of human relationships that surround them.
But the parable insists that we don't. Human lives, like those root systems, are infinitely complex and deeply entangled. The person you have confidently identified as a tare is likely intertwined with the emotional and economic survival of a dozen wheat stalks.
If you go on a self-righteous crusade to rip out every flawed person, every hypocrite, and every toxic element from your organization, your family, or your church, you will not achieve a pure field. You will achieve a barren, utterly destroyed wasteland.
It demands an almost impossible level of humility. It requires us to accept the agonizing reality that good and evil, health and toxicity will coexist in our world, in our institutions, and frankly, within the soil of our own hearts until the very end.
We are not omniscient. We are not equipped to be the final judges of the field. Our mandate is not to police the weeds. Our mandate is to ensure we are growing as wheat. We are asked to bear the discomfort of the tension, to continue producing good fruit, and to trust the master of the harvest to execute perfect justice when the time is right.
That is an incredibly heavy yet profoundly liberating reality to grapple with. It is the fundamental difference between anxiously trying to control the universe and trusting the ultimate process of growth. Looking back over the massive expanse of territory we've covered today, it is staggering how these ancient chapters dissect the human condition.
They really do.
We began by watching the radical redefinition of authority, an authority that proves its power not through distance, but by physically grasping the untouchable leper and praising the faith of the occupying enemy.
We examine the biology and theology of panic, learning that navigating the external storms of our lives requires an anchored internal trust, not just a frantic bailing of water.
We held up a mirror to our own societies, realizing how often we, like the ancient villagers, prefer the quiet predictability of human suffering over the expensive, disruptive cost of restoring the broken.
We then confronted the unflinching reality of the cost. The pursuit of this truth is not a comfortable hobby. It demands the vulnerability of having nowhere to lay your head, and the courage to wield a sword that may divide us from our deepest systemic dysfunctions.
Yet we discovered that bearing this cost is the only way to escape the crushing, performative yoke of legalism. By stepping into the shared yoke of grace and constructing new wineskins to hold that reality, we find actual, sustainable rest.
And we ended in the dirt.
Yeah, we challenged ourselves to examine the soil of our own minds. Are we cynical? Are we shallow? Or are we allowing the endless trivia and financial anxiety of the modern world to choke out our depth?
And finally, we faced the humbling call to put down our pitchforks, to stop trying to violently purge the field of everyone who fails our purity tests, and to trust the slow, agonizingly patient work of the harvest. It is a cohesive, disruptive, and intensely beautiful architecture for human life.
It really is.
As we close this deep dive, I want to direct your imagination to one final, remarkably brief parable tucked into chapter 13. It is the parable of the mustard seed. The text observes that the kingdom of heaven, the reality of this wisdom, begins like a single grain of mustard seed.
Which is incredibly tiny.
To the naked eye, it is the smallest, most insignificant speck of matter. It looks entirely powerless. But when it is planted, it slowly, imperceptibly grows until it becomes a massive tree, so large that the birds of the air come and find shelter in its branches. Think about the quiet, unseen, seemingly insignificant efforts you make to live this out.
The choice to initiate a difficult conversation. The decision to touch the leper in your community when everyone else looks away.
The restraint it takes to hold your tongue and not rip out a weed in a moment of self-righteous anger. The daily discipline of weeding the thorns of anxiety from your mind. They feel so incredibly small against the massive machinery of the world.
But what if the tiny, uncelebrated acts of mercy you plant today are actually the seeds of a profound, sheltering canopy that someone you love will desperately need to survive a storm tomorrow?
That's a thought worth sitting with.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.